Today's show is sponsored by Vasion Print. The problem with print is it's a resource suck. IT teams are spending too much time on troubleshooting and upkeep. The biggest offender? Print servers. So get rid of them. Swap your outdated, resource-intensive infrastructure for Vasion Print, formerly known as Printer Logic, and get serverless, direct IP, secure printing for any device, anywhere. Centralized print management reduces overhead and workload and increases productivity, which is great for your IT team and your bottom line. Increase security, remove scripts and GPOs, and enable self-service user deployments. Secure, seamless, and scalable. That's what you get when you eliminate print servers. See how at Vasion.com.
Cloudcast Media presents from the massive studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. This is the Cloudcast with Aaron Delp and Brian Gracely, bringing you the best of cloud computing from around the world.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome back to the Cloudcast. We are coming to you live from the massive Cloudcast studios here in Raleigh, North Carolina. Last show of July. Summer is still hot. I think we have another month or so here of summer. I hope everybody's doing well. Another weekend perspective. And I'm going to dive a little bit today into kind of just some thoughts I had. I had an interesting conversation with a CEO not too long ago. And we were talking about, where they're going strategically with some things around cloud and AI. And he brought up an interesting kind of topic conversation. We got into, kind of talking about what they might be doing with their AI journey, what was working, what wasn't working, kind of how he was motivating the company. But he brought up an interesting kind of sidebar talking about AI agents. And we didn't get into too much about exactly what they were doing, but he was kind of talking about, how he was thinking about it and how he was trying to figure out, how much of kind of the internal workings of his company he might have to change as he starts to, roll out, implement AI agents. But he was looking at it more from the perspective of, comparing agents to people in terms of like, do I have to change my HR systems? Do I have to, things like that? And so I thought it would be sort of interesting. I've been thinking about that for a couple of weeks now, lots of dog walks and so forth. And thought it might be interesting to sort of dive into some of the aspects beyond the, which framework do you use, and do you use MCP and things like that, and kind of get into kind of more of the details of, what may come out of, people rolling out AI agents. So we'll dig into that after the break. Today's show is sponsored by Factor. Still verifying help desk callers with questions hackers can Google? Every security question is a vulnerability waiting to be exploited. If you're using Okta, Factor Identity Portal transforms your organization's verification process. Authenticate users with real-time MFA factors in seconds, not minutes. Slash call time 60%. Eliminate social engineering attacks. And streamline help desk workflows. Check out Factor's Taco AI, the first AI agent for Okta, on their website. Your team gets one powerful dashboard for all user verification needs. Try Factor, factor.io. That's FCTR.io. Free for 60 days. Today's show is sponsored by Doit. Cloud spend is just the surface. What really matters is how it drives performance, reliability, and speed to market. Doit Cloud Intelligence aligns every dollar to the intent of the workloads. Doit is trusted by companies like Fiverr, HackerRank, Current, and Superbet. Doit helps teams go beyond dashboards, surfacing hidden inefficiencies, resolving incidents faster, and aligning cloud operations with business priorities. One platform, unified signals, better outcomes across engineering and finance. Visit doit.com, that's DOIT.com, to unlock intent-aware FinOps at scale. Doit Cloud Intelligence. And we're back. And as I mentioned at the top of the show, we're going to kind of dig a little bit into kind of, some of the, what are our expectations? What happens if AI agents are successful within your organization? If this whole phenomenon around AI agents and kind of the evolution of how we do work, really starts to kick into gear, like what happens if they're successful? And I started kind of asking myself a bunch of questions about, not just, the technology, which technology people use, and, how wildly successful it would be, and will it be open source, or will it be tied to a certain model, and all those sort of things that we probably typically would talk about, on any one of our interview shows or something like that. But I thought it might be interesting to sort of dig into, some of the other ramifications of kind of the intersection of people and agents, and how businesses might adapt to certain things. So I made a bunch of questions, a bunch of topics, and I kind of thought I would go through this. And the first one that came to mind, the first one I got to thinking about was, what are our expectations of AI agents? What I mean by that is not, are they going to, displace jobs? Are they going to, be 10 times as good as things? Or, what kind of, but at a really basic level, like, what do we think they're going to be? do we think of them as assistants to humans? So, do we expect that, kind of the thing that's been talked about a lot, which is, you're going to get an assistant, somebody who's going to, manage your calendar, or, sit in on meetings for you, or, do a bunch of the mundane work that you don't want to do. Is it going to be kind of an assistant? Do we expect that they're going to, so in that case, they're sort of tied to the hip with you. They're almost like a pair programmer in that context. But do we expect them to be assistant? Do we expect them to do a bunch of autonomous work? In which maybe, if you were to think about it, this is the scope of my role, and I could start to sort of divvy up things that I just sort of, you figure out how you program them, or you tell it what to do, or you give it access to previous work that you've done, and it learns from that, and then it goes off and does things autonomously, right? So maybe you give it a set of problems, and it just figures out how to solve those problems without having to, you making them into a bunch of tasks or whatever those things might be. So, that was my first thing: is do we think of them as assistants? Do we think of them as autonomous work? Is our expectation that they're going to work, 40-hour week, 50-hour week, similar to whatever you might do? So you're sort of tied to the agent, sort of tied to you in terms of the hours that you work, for example, or do we expect them to be working 24/7? And I think they're probably going to be somewhere in between a lot of those things. But that sort of felt like the beginning of what we're getting into, because I think that helps us start to understand what's the expectation for this thing, right? Does it augment you? Does it kind of build a Venn diagram of you and them and the amount of work that you do, and they're running in parallel to you, those types of things. So I thought that was the first thing that would be an interesting discussion. The second one is how do we treat AI agents? How do we think about AI agents? And what I mean by that is, do we think of them as tools, right? So, I kind of went back and I was like, are these things really unique? I kind of applied, as I like to talk about Gracely's theorem, right? There are no new ideas. There's just more bandwidth and cheaper processors. We've had things that we could, assign to go off and do autonomous tasks for us, right? So we've had cron jobs and batch jobs and robotic process automation and, AI ops and a bunch of, there have been things for a while that would go off and do autonomous stuff for us and automated things for us. So do we just think of these as yet another set of tools, in which case, they're probably going to be, for the most part, in the hands of technical types of people, but the same way that we give tools to accounting groups, we give them Excel and those types of tools. And what do we expect the extent of this to be? But first and foremost, do we think of them as tools, or do we start to think about them as agents? As employees, right? Do we think of as an agent similar to an employee, right? It would get an employee number. It would have obviously an employee login, some sort of history of what it's done. We would evaluate it in various ways. And this was kind of the origin of that conversation I had with the CEO about him saying, "Hey, I might need to, I'm thinking about a bunch of things, including like, changing my HR system to deal with AI agents." And, we've seen companies like Workday talks about it in their, "Hey, everybody's a rock star" commercial. They manage, HR and AI agents. And I kind of got to thinking of like, is that concept like, well, here's a chat bot that helps you with your insurance filings every year? Or is this like, hey, Steve's team has 50 AI agents working on whatever. They could be building the next great product for you, or they could be doing research for you or something. But so I got to think, do we think about them as tools, or do we think about them as employees, or do we think about them as like virtual teammates, right? Sort of the same way that we think about, you can drop something into a meeting today and it will do, it will listen to the meeting, it will transcribe it. It might have some way of, doing calendar and, calendar things or action items or something. Like how are we going to plan to treat these things? And again, I think this is going to be an interesting perspective, because again, when we think about these things just in terms of like, hey, I'm just writing them on a whiteboard or a PowerPoint or something like that. Like, you don't kind of go through this. And then, when we do kind of think about where they're going to interact with people, it does become interesting, because if you think about all the sort of human dynamics that go on within organizations, within a group, within a team, within a community, just sort of normal human interactions, there's a whole dynamic that goes on there. Who leads, who's second or third in terms of command or responsibility. What's the accountability model of the system? And so if we don't really understand like what agents, how they're going to fit into those roles, it's going to be interesting to see how the sort of agent and human interaction is going to go on. The third thing I asked myself was, how are we going to organize AI agents, right? Will it be sort of a manager and agent relationship similar to like a manager and an individual contributor? Is it going to be, as I mentioned, an individual contributor and an agent similar to a tool or a co-pilot or a um, pair programmer or something along those lines? Is it going to be sort of manager, IC, and agent? Are we going to see an agent manager of a bunch of managers? And I kind of bring this up because I think it's going to be interesting to sort of watch the dynamics of how things are measured, how budgets are allocated for people that have humans on the team or agents on the team, some combination of them, whether, having an agent counts as like a full budget type of thing. Obviously, people are going to try and, figure out a cost for that. But, at least within the enterprise, that's always been a difficult thing. Even if it was a cloud service, you might say, well, I'm paying $200 a month for that thing. So it's really like, whatever $200 a month times 12 is, $24,000 or something, or $20,000 a month or whatever the latest AI, open AI thing is. But then you start to get into, well, how many tokens, how many, like all the other aspects of that, do you, what else do you have to do sort of care and feeding the same way that you, talk about sort of all in costs for an employee that includes, healthcare and a desk and a laptop and all those other sorts of things. So it'll be interesting to see how all those things sort of get measured and accounted for, and then how teams end up getting paired to each other in terms of, well, that team has 10 people. Okay, well, how many agents do they have, right? Is it 10 people plus 50 agents? Is it some sort of part-time, sharing type of thing? If you have 10 people, do you get X number of agents per person? Does it depend on what the job is for the agent? The same way that like, if you had to pay for a lawyer, that's probably going to be a much higher, more expensive job than if you were paying for a security guard, or if you were paying for, a junior developer or something along those lines, right? Like how are we going to kind of think through that? And that sort of leads me to one of my other questions was, are we going to have the concept of like junior and senior agents, right? So obviously, we can apply an agent to a task. So if we said, for example, like this is an agent that's helping a lawyer, does that automatically imply the idea that since the lawyer is probably fairly expensive, that the agent should be fairly expensive? Or, if we're giving somebody sort of a junior set of tasks, but for a lawyer, does that imply the idea of sort of like like a paralegal or just administrator or something along those lines? And that's probably a terrible analogy for anybody in the legal industry. But, are we going to have the concept of like junior engineers and senior engineers when, in concept, I guess you could say, well, maybe if we only apply a certain level of a model to an agent, that might be a junior engineer because it's going to be hampered by less intelligent model. Or if we apply it to a lesser GPU, hence that it shouldn't be as fast or it doesn't have as much memory or whatever it might be, maybe that'll imply a junior level agent. But I think, you're not going to necessarily have the easy way of being like, well, that person's worked in the job for 3 to 5 years, so they're still a junior. And if they've worked in it from 7 to 10 years, they're probably, going to be like a senior type of agent. I think that'll be an interesting thing to do, because I think you're going to get into, again, some measurement issues, some costing issues, some expectation issues. And then, do we ever have to think about promoting an agent? I mean, in theory, that sounds sort of weird, like, oh, well, the thing, you just would blow it away and start over with a new one. But, maybe there will be a concept of, this agent and the type of work it's doing has learned enough to sort of be elevated to something, and maybe at least from an accounting perspective internally. So I thought that was, something worth exploring. Now, the next thing that was on my list was, how do we manage AI agents? And what I mean by that is, we have ways of managing people, at least setting expectations, having levels of accountability, having levels of sort of check-in. What have you done? What do we expect you to do? How are you improving? What's your plan for improving? All those sort of things. Do we do those sort of things for AI agents? Do we measure them by success rates? Do we measure them by failure rates? Tasks completed? Do we have to, depending on over time, if somebody, if an agent works on something for a year or so, do we start to fit them into bell curves for salary or bands for salary or those types of things, right? Like this is where, kind of get into the idea of like, well, does it make sense to sort of treat them as if we do other people in our organization. I guess you're going to want to in terms of accountability or the type of level of quality of work that they do. But then how do we do we need to do something that then measures them in the same way that we can kind of compare apples and oranges, or apples and apples, or apples and pears, or whatever, between somebody who does the task by themselves, maybe somebody who does the task with an agent as a co-pilot, and then an agent by itself. And I think that'll be sort of an interesting thing to do, because I think we have a hard enough time today measuring the output of certain work, especially kind of knowledge work, versus if you're working in a factory, you could measure number of widgets, number of tasks, number of errors, all those sorts of things. But we seem to have a harder time with knowledge work, whether it's software development or marketing, creating stuff, or whatever it is, business development people doing whatever the heck they do, right? So I think that'll be sort of an interesting thing to watch is where do we draw the lines on that? Do people sort of take an AI native approach to things? Do we do sort of a hybrid thing with humans and so forth? And so I think that'll be interesting to watch. And then I had a bunch of questions about kind of how managers are going to treat this, right? So are we going to see a bunch of internal competition for managers trying to get AI agent budget, right? Because obviously these things won't be free. They will be paid for somehow, because they're going to be associated with with a GPU and a model and access to the model and number of tokens and all those sorts of things, and potentially guardrails, development cost, all that sort of stuff. Do we see internal competition from managers trying to get this? I would assume we would. I think it'll be interesting to see, how that plays itself out, especially as we're, in the early days and we don't really know how to measure. We don't really know how to account for what an agent's going to cost for me. We don't really even know how to account for, what, aside from like, hey, this is my $20 ChatGPT account or my $200 ChatGPT account. Like, I don't think we really know how to account for it in an enterprise setting yet today. So I think that'll be very, very interesting to watch, especially as we start to see some, some kind of skunkworks, POC, center of excellence things happening, and managers, looking out for themselves and saying, hey, if I could, spend some time on the weekend, learn this stuff, start to build my own agents, I could, bump my numbers way, way up. And I don't even necessarily have to tell people about this, especially if I can keep the cost low. And then at some point, people will get kind of curious, like, hey, why is Bill's team doing so well, so much better than they were before? Or, maybe Bill may feel the need to talk internally about how great he's doing about this, and get other managers, kind of jealous of how well he's doing. So, anyways, I think that'll be sort of interesting. Next thing I had on my list is how companies are going to measure projects, and how well the projects, or what's the composition of the project? Is the project X number of people plus agents? Is the measurement a percentage of agents? Is the measurement, something that's less focused on the, who did the work and what's the output of the work? I think all those things are going to be very, very interesting, especially as we get into, work that is collaborative across teams, some mix of humans and agents and so forth. So I think that's going to be a very fascinating thing to sort of watch, because I think it's, there's always talks that we have at conferences in which somebody comes up and says, well, this is how you should do it. This is the framework you should have. And I'm sure there'll be consulting organizations that do this stuff. But, in reality, it is, it always feels like a burden, for organizations to be able to have to do all that internal accounting, especially if it's, requires a chargeback or a showback or something along those lines. We've seen this, in other new technologies that have getting rolled out. So I think that'll be a very interesting thing to watch. And then the last thing I had on my list was something that, it sort of spurred my mind as we talked about some of these, AI startups and them getting rated by companies as instead of getting acquired and so forth, is, we often see, managers and teams that get built. And if that manager or the team decides to leave, oftentimes they leave together, right? This group of people have worked together. They know each other. They work well together. They like the leadership structure. They understand each other's nuances. They have the same motivation. And we see them leave and go to a different team from time to time. I think it'll be really interesting to see what the dynamic will be is if managers leave or leaders leave, how do they take their agents with them, right? The same dynamic that might have made them successful. It'll be interesting to see how companies treat the intellectual property of of agents, right? So today, for example, it's very hard to create an NDA in the tech world, especially if you're in like California, for example. A little more difficult. Like in Boston, I know from state to state it's a little bit different, but in general across the tech industry, it's hard to put NDAs on people. We've had some obviously high profile ones at Google and Amazon and so forth, but in general, you would say, like, if I left a job, I can probably go somewhere else. And for the most part, the work that you do is not so high profile that, you're going to get restricted. It can happen. But, how does that happen with agents, right? Like if you created a whole bunch of work, obviously some of it's going to be tied to the data that was specific to the company. And you obviously can't take the data with you, at least not legally. But what about all the work, the logic of how to make a set of agents work? I'll be very curious to sort of see how this works, how much people sort of, keep things hidden off on a, private GitHub repo somewhere, and can people track that stuff down? But especially if you're, managing a project or, an organization that is, starting to tip more than 50% with, sort of these artificial resources to make it work. What is that dynamic going to look like in terms of when people leave? How are they able to take with them what made them successful, or how hard will it be for them to recreate, the logic, the experience, all those sort of things that you could do if you took a bunch of people with you. So, anyways, just a bunch of things that were kind of on my mind in terms of starting to think about not just the technologies that are behind these AI agent things, or how you manage them, or how do you build them, but what are some of the people dynamics that are out there? So we'd love to hear people's feedback. If you're working on this stuff, if it's early days at your company, or if you've been, you have some experience with this stuff, love to hear your feedback. Show at thecloudcast.net. We'd love to hear about it. Shoot us an email. We'd love to have you on the show to talk about it. So with that, I'll wrap it up. Hope everybody's doing well. I will be off for a few days and going to enjoy some sunshine in the islands. And Aaron will be with you all week. And then we'll be back next week. So with that, we'll talk to you later. Talk to you next week.
Thank you for listening to The Cloudcast. Please visit thecloudcast.net to find more shows, show notes, videos, and everything social media.